Scientific Officer and owner of Realm Labs. We make a product called NeuRemedy, which contains benfotiamine, which I'm going to be speaking to you about. I'm going to talk to you about peripheral neuropathy, and obviously it's damage or disease to one of the peripheral nerves, or all of the peripheral nerves. The thing about peripheral neuropathy that we're just learning about it, it's much more pernicious, much more dangerous than we thought. It used to be that it was just an annoyance, or maybe it made you a little less stable when you walk, or made you more prone to an ulceration. There's much greater implications than that. In the studies, the thrust of the knowledge about this is indicating that significantly. This is a study that was published a couple of years ago. It was an analysis of a screening survey that was done by the government in the early 2000s, late 1900s. They looked at peripheral neuropathy and looked at it whether they were diabetic or not, and looked at the mortality that was involved. The way they did this is they measured, they looked at 7,000 or so adults, and they looked at, they followed them over a number of years, 13 years, and they looked at what happened to those adults and went back and said which had neuropathy, which did not. And as a result of this study, about 2,100 people died over that 13-year period. First thing that came out from this study, and this was out of Johns Hopkins, the University of Mississippi, a really good scientist with a big cohort. First thing they discovered was about 35 million Americans with peripheral neuropathy. That's 10% of the country. That's massive. And we're doing better than a lot of other countries. You go into the Caribbean, it's much, much higher. But nonetheless, this is a significant number. When I started practicing in the early 80s, it's a long time ago now, when I think about it, you rarely saw somebody with peripheral neuropathy. And as I continued practicing, it morphed, and it got to the point where most everybody had some sort of peripheral neuropathy. So this has been changing. When they looked at this, they looked at mortality rates. They measured it by 1,000 person years, and the following data fell out. If you're a non-diabetic, your mortality rate went up significantly if you had peripheral neuropathy. This happened in diabetics also, and this is relatively good science. So think about that. Peripheral neuropathy increased mortality rate more than diabetes in this study. And it's a good study with a big cohort, done by real scientists. Diabetes is the seventh leading cause of death in America. And the data from this showing that peripheral neuropathy was even more dangerous with respect to mortality rate than diabetes. That's very powerful information. And the question becomes, if you treat peripheral neuropathy, you decrease that mortality rate. And nobody knows, no one's looked at it. And I think it depends on why the neuropathy came about, but if there's a nutritional element to the peripheral neuropathy, you would suspect that fixing the nutritional deficit would help in many ways, and it may even impact mortality rate, although that's complete speculation on my part. It's a very, very difficult problem that we have treating peripheral neuropathy in general, because there are just so many causes of peripheral neuropathy. And we're not neurologists, we're foot doctors. People come into us with numb feet. And you can work it up extensively, and most people don't. And if you want to, you can check for sarcoidosis, you can check for paraneoplastics and your amyloidosis. But in reality, we don't do that. We go ahead and we try and fix people with nutrients or suppress their nervous system with antidepressants or other medications that suppress nervous system function. The problem becomes much more easy from a clinical perspective when you think about what's walking into your office. You're not going to get a lot of people with peripheral neuropathy from sarcoidosis walking into your office. Most common type of peripheral neuropathy you're going to see. Now, a neuroma is a peripheral neuropathy. Carpal tunnel, tarsal tunnel, trigeminal neuralgia, peripheral neuropathies. But in reality, what we see almost all of the time with respect to this is something called polyneuropathy. Polyneuropathy is the most common type of peripheral neuropathy, and it's when people walk into you with this dying back length-dependent deficit in the peripheral nervous system. It's a non-traumatic, generalized disorder of the peripheral nervous system that ascends up in time up the feet and legs and the stocking blood distribution, because it turns out it's probably energy dependent. The pathology going on in polyneuropathy probably has to do with not enough energy or ATP available to the peripheral nerve stored properly. And as that pathology increases, The nerves that require the most energy fail in that manner. The longest nerves require the most energy, the shorter nerves require less energy. So over years and over time, you have that ascension. And that ascension correlates with the length of the nerve, the energy required to make the nerve run, and the ATP available. And we all know what people with polyneuropathy look like. They present with burning, tingling, numbness, shooting pain, stopping blood distribution, instability with gait. Now, when you look at the 150 causes, the very many causes of peripheral neuropathy, you can get your hands around this. You can make people better when you realize that the vast majority of people walk into your office are diabetic, pre-diabetic, alcoholic, or they're older, and that's why they're developing the neuropathy. If you remember before I told you the 35 million Americans we think with peripheral neuropathy, there are about 10 million of them are diabetic, and it seems that about 18 million of them are pre-diabetic. It's a massive problem that's really very unrecognized. About 6 or 7 million alcoholics with peripheral neuropathy. That's the majority of people with peripheral neuropathy walking into your office. So if someone walks into your office with this bilateral deficit, burning, tingling, numbness, and shooting pain, they're most likely in this group. And these groups can be helped via nutritional means. Polyneuropathies, which we're talking about now, it's a peripheral neurodegeneration. When we take these biopsies, as I'm sure many of us do, and we look at epidermal nerve density, you see there's decreased density, there's less nervous system there. It's a degenerative process. Very analogous, and I'll get to this in a minute, to Alzheimer's. You take an MRI of an Alzheimer's brain, it's all shriveled up. And a healthy brain, it's all puffy, it's big. There's neurodegenerative processes going on in the peripheral nervous system that very likely parallel what's going on in the central nervous system. We really never looked at this before. This is a relatively new conclusion. It turns out that if you have type 2 diabetes and you have a peripheral neuropathy, you probably have cognitive deficit. Maybe it was never noticed or picked up before. It's a tough thing to measure cognitive deficit. To a much greater extent than somebody who has diabetes without peripheral neuropathy. This study came out really very eye-opening, correlating neurodegenerative changes in the peripheral and central nervous system, which we should look for. I'm going to rush through this because there's time constraints. And it very often is correlated to vitamin B1 deficiency. Vitamin B1 deficiency, or thiamine, is much, much more common than we thought. And it more likely should be called insufficiency because the numbers that we consider to be deficiency, et cetera, often are valid, but this patient still improves when you give them thiamine, which they have insufficient amount to run the nervous system. What is thiamine? What is vitamin B1? Well, it's an energy vitamin. There's something called the Krebs cycle in the middle of your mitochondria. And if I wanted to put you all to sleep, I'd put up a diagram of the Krebs cycle, but I'm not going to do that to you. The Krebs cycle produces energy, it produces ATP from carbohydrates that come into the mitochondria. So consider this to be an energy vitamin. Thiamine, vitamin B1, is responsible, and essential for the production of ATP. A deficit in thiamine will cause less ATP production. The mechanism is via the Krebs cycle. And it turns out that vitamin B1 deficiency is well documented in diabetics, alcoholics, and the elderly. It's very likely to be the case in pre-diabetics, but no one is looking at that. And these groups have a very high incidence of polyneuropathy. There's a correlation there. And in and of itself, if you would just starve somebody with thiamine or vitamin B1, they would develop a polyneuropathy. It used to be called beriberi. And diagnosing vitamin B1 deficiency, you can go ahead and you can run tests, and they may be valid or not, but generally what's done clinically is you give them excessive amount of vitamin B1 and you see if they get better. If they have a deficit like a peripheral neuropathy that is indicative or maybe indicative of thiamine deficiency, give them thiamine and you'll know in a month's time. That's what we're finding. The problem with vitamin B1, one of the problems with vitamin B1 is that it's very, very poorly absorbed. It's water soluble, which means it needs a transporter molecule in the gut to get into the bloodstream, and that transporter molecule system is subject to damage. It can be blocked and inhibited. Alcoholics damage it when they drink. If they drink excessively, they may be thiamine deficient their whole lives, even if they stop drinking, because they damage the transporter molecules. The most common medicine used for diabetics which is metformin, inhibits vitamin B1 absorption, as well as vitamin B12 absorption. So diabetics who tend to be B1 deficient have the double problem of the fact that they're taking the medicine to control their diabetes, which also inhibits absorption of B1. Turns out that only 5% of vitamin B1 is absorbed from the gut, and that's the problem. So the way to manage that is to give a more highly absorbable form of vitamin B1, and that's benfotiamine. It's a lipid-soluble form. It's an antioxidant, it's anti-inflammatory, and what I want to stress is it's incredibly safe. It's been around since the early 60s, and there's just no adverse effects associated with it. I have a lot of clients who are podiatrists who give it out to their patients, and if there's any problem with anything, I get a phone call. I don't get phone calls. We're talking about tens of thousands of people here. So this is an extremely safe product which has been used safely since the 1960s. 17 years ago, a patient came into my office. She had a brutal neuropathy, a polyneuropathy. I really couldn't help her. I tried, antidepressants, etc. But I practiced in South Florida. It was April. So I treated her as best I could, and she left. Because everybody leaves South Florida if they have the money for the summer. And she came back in December. And I said to her, this is an absolute true story. I said to her, so how's your neuropathy, Mrs. Smith? Although her name wasn't Smith. And she said, well, that's fine, Dr. Mann, but I got an ingrown toenail here I want you to look at. And I stopped her and I said, what do you mean your neuropathy's fine? Neuropathies don't get better. Which at that time was the case. The best we could do is suppress the pain, and tingling and paresthesias. She said, well, I went to Switzerland, they gave me this stuff, and it took my neuropathy, took my pain and my neuropathy away in a month. And I said to her what you would have said to her, which is, so what's the name of that stuff? It turns out the name of that stuff was benfotiamine, and as the poet said, that's changed everything for me. I took a road less followed, and I started studying it. The first thing I did is I discovered that it was used worldwide, but it wasn't in the States, and it wasn't in Canada, for whatever reason. And I spent a lot of money on forensic pathologists to make sure that what we had was safe. I did all the studies, and once I discovered, I was completely certain that this was enormously safe. I started using it in my office and started giving it. There was only one company that sold a little bit of benfotiamine at that time, and I had some local friends and doctors who were using it as well. And what we all found, it works in 3 to 4 weeks. It partially restored sensation, which is amazing. The symptoms recurred if you stop taking benfotiamine in about 2 months' time, and it helped diabetics and non-diabetics. And I didn't know why any of this was the case, but this is what everybody was finding. And subsequently, starting about 15 years ago, studies came in which documented what was going on with benfotiamine and showed why all of these observations that we had were actually based in the science of it. And the studies were done significantly because so many people worldwide were getting better with this scourge, this polyneuropathy scourge, as a result of vitamins. So people started studying it. This is done by a guy named Michael Brownlee, a brilliant diabetic researcher, looked at the pathobiology of diabetes, and it turns out that diabetes damages certain cell types. The cell types that it damages are those that can't keep the internal concentration of glucose at low levels when there's hyperglycemia. And for the purposes of our discussion, one of the types of cells is the Schwann cells and the neurons of the peripheral nervous system. So diabetes is damaging these, and the mechanism by which it damages is by these pathways that happen internally into the cell. And then word came out that showed that benfotiamine actually blocked these pathological pathways. Made a lot of sense because that's what we were observing clinically. And then it turned out that studies were done, this study was done about 15 years ago out of England, where they looked at vitamin B1 levels in diabetics, and they found out that diabetics are endemically vitamin B1 deficient. Whether it's type 2 or type 1 diabetes, they have 75%, I got 2 minutes? Well, it's nice speaking to you. I don't know what to say, other than diabetics have 75% less thiamine or vitamin B1 in their blood, and the reason that is they urinate out their thiamine. So what's happening, what you're observing in diabetics is they go into B1 deficiency, they urinate out their B1, they get less and less vitamin B1, and it reacts in the peripheral nervous system, by a deficit in the functioning of the peripheral nervous system. This is metformin also, as I said to you before, inhibits absorption. This is a group out of Italy who looked at vitamin B1 and they found there was an intimate relationship between it. Then subsequently a study was done in Germany that looked at diabetes and peripheral neuropathy with polyneuropathy and benfotiamine. And if you notice, you'll see that after 6 weeks there's a decrease in pain, there's a decrease in numbness, which means an increase in sensation, decreased burning and paresthesias, which was exactly what we were observing. There's a similarity. I talked to you before about a correlation between central neurodegeneration and peripheral neurodegeneration. It's more than just speculation. There's a lot of similarities between Alzheimer's disease and diabetic polyneuropathy. Some people wrote a paper on type 3 diabetes being known as Alzheimer's. These, and I don't have the time to elucidate each of them, but these are things that are common with people with a polyneuropathy, peripheral neurodegeneration, and Alzheimer's. And it turns out there's a lot of work going on now showing that Alzheimer's, people with Alzheimer's have vitamin B1 processing issues, and they don't get better when you give them regular vitamin B1. But this is a study that was done in China 10 years ago. 5 people with Alzheimer's did significantly better when they gave them benfotiamine. This is out of Serbia. 3 people with Alzheimer's, they all did significantly better when they gave benfotiamine. This is a study out of Weill Cornell in New York. It was a cohort of 70 people with Alzheimer's. The ones who got benfotiamine had significant improvement. This was so impressive that the government decided to support this group with a $45 million grant. The results of this study won't be out for another 5 years. The other point that I want to make is that this correlation between peripheral and central neurodegeneration is very frank in people who are alcoholics, people who had a history of drinking excessively, damaging the mechanism by which they absorb thiamine from the gut. They go into B1 deficiency. It also doesn't matter if they stopped drinking 10 years ago. They've still damaged that mechanism. These people have cognitive issues and they have neurological issues in the peripheral nervous system as a result of being B1 deficient. And when you give them click and tell me then. When you give them B1 in the form of benfotiamine, you make them significantly better. And I suggest that if you made somebody with a polyneuropathy better with benfotiamine, you ask them how they're doing cognitively, and very, very often they'll say, I feel a little bit sharper. I could go on for another hour, but I'm noticing people standing here, so I'm not going to do that. I'm very honored that Beth is going to come after me. Thank you, Richard. And thank you all. It's an honor and a privilege.